His partner died in the line of duty, but this police K-9 dog wasn't done fighting. When Officer Jake Holloway is killed in a brutal ambush, his loyal K-9 partner, Echo, is left grieving, but something isn't right. Detective Daniel Briggs takes Echo in, only to realize the dog is fixated on a case Jake was secretly investigating before his death. As Daniel digs deeper, deadly secrets unravel, and with Echo leading the way, they uncover a truth that someone is willing to kill to keep buried. The night air was cold. A sharp wind blew through the empty warehouse, making the rusted metal sheets rattle. The place smelled old, like oil, dirt, and something bitter that made Echo's nose twitch. The German shepherd moved carefully, his paws pressing against the dusty floor. His ears flicked at the faintest noise, and his sharp eyes scanned the dark corners. Beside him, Officer Jake Holloway walked forward, his gun steady in his hands. His breathing was slow, controlled. His heart pounded in his chest, but he had been in dangerous situations before. He trusted Echo. The dog had saved him many times, and together, they had caught criminals who thought they could escape. Then, bang, a gunshot exploded in the silence. Echo barked loudly, his deep growl shaking the air. Jake grunted, his body jerking as a bullet slammed into him. His knees gave out, and he dropped hard onto the floor. His gun slipped from his grip, sliding away. Blood bloomed across his chest, warm and thick, soaking through his uniform. More gunshots. The sharp cracks of bullets echoed off the walls, each shot ringing like a hammer on metal. The shadows moved fast, figures disappearing into the darkness. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. Silence. Echo turned wildly, his sharp teeth flashing, ready to fight. But the attackers were gone. His chest heaved as he breathed fast, his fur bristling, his muscles tight. Then he turned back to Jake. The man lay on his back, his face pale under the dim light. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his breaths coming in short, painful gasps. Echo whined, nudging Jake's arm, licking his fingers. Jake blinked slowly, his lips parting as if he wanted to speak. His hand moved weakly toward Echo, fingers shaking. Then he stopped. His arm fell limp. His breath stilled. His eyes, once so full of life, stared upward, empty. Echo let out a long, low whine. His tail, once high and proud, drooped. He licked Jake's face again, waiting, hoping. But Jake didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. In the distance, sirens screamed. Blue and red lights flashed against the warehouse walls. Soon, the place filled with police officers. Heavy boots stomped against the ground. Someone yelled. Radios crackled. When they found Echo, he was still lying beside Jake, his head resting on his partner's chest. His ears were flat against his head, his body curled in defeat. He didn't growl, didn't fight. He just lay there, waiting. The case was closed quickly. They called it a gang attack, random, with no real reason. No arrests were made, no suspects found. Detective Daniel Briggs didn't believe it. Jake had been his best friend. They had been through so much together. Long nights, chasing criminals, watching each other's backs. Jake wasn't the type to walk into danger without knowing the risks. Something wasn't right. But without proof, there was nothing Daniel could do. After the funeral, Echo was left alone. The police department had no place for a dog without a handler. He had done his duty, and now they wanted to retire him. But Daniel couldn't let that happen. So, he took him home. At first, Echo barely moved. He sat by the front door for hours, staring at it. Every time footsteps passed outside, his ears perked up, his tail lifted slightly. But when the door never opened for Jake, his body sank again. He refused to eat. He refused to play. At night, he whimpered in his sleep. His paws twitched, as if running in a dream. Maybe chasing someone. Maybe trying to reach Jake. One evening, Echo slowly stood up and walked across the room. Jake's old police jacket hung over a chair. Echo sniffed it, pushing his nose into the fabric, then curled up beside it. His head rested on the sleeve, his eyes half open. He was waiting. Daniel sat nearby, gripping Echo's collar in his hands. His fingers ran over the leather, feeling the name engraved on the metal tag. Jake Holloway. You miss him, don't you, boy? He whispered. Echo didn't move, but Daniel saw his ears flick slightly. The pain was deep, heavy. Jake's death didn't feel right. And if there was one thing Daniel knew, for sure, Echo never forgot. Maybe the dog knew something that no one else did. Daniel needed to clear his head. He had spent too many days stuck in his apartment, staring at Jake's old case files, searching for answers that wouldn't come. Maybe taking Echo out would help. He decided to visit an old friend, Victor Alvarez, who owned a local auto repair shop. Victor had always been well respected. A friendly man, always smiling, always helpful. He had no criminal record, no trouble with the law, just a simple, hard-working business owner. The shop smelled of oil, grease, and metal. The scent of burnt rubber hung in the air. A mechanic worked under a car, the sound of tools clicking against metal filling the space. Daniel pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling. Echo walked beside him, his paws tapping softly against the floor. Victor looked up from behind the counter, a smile spreading across his face. "Detective Briggs, been a while. What brings you in?" Daniel rested his hand on the hood of his car. "Just thought I'd get a checkup done." He patted Echo's head, brought Echo along for some fresh air. Victor leaned forward slightly, his eyes softening. "Ah, the famous Echo." His voice lowered. "I heard about Jake. It's a real shame. He was a good man." Daniel nodded, about to respond. But then, Echo froze. His body stiffened, his ears shot up, and his fur bristled. A deep growl rumbled in his throat. It was low, threatening, the kind of sound that made people take a step back. Victor blinked, his smile faltering. Something wrong?" He let out a short, nervous laugh. Echo bared his teeth. His lips curled back, revealing sharp fangs. Then he lunged. Daniel yanked back on the leash, his muscles straining. Echo snarled, his claws scraping against the floor. His eyes were locked onto Victor, burning with anger. Victor stepped back quickly, his hands raised. "Whoa, I didn't do anything." His voice cracked slightly. Daniel pulled hard on the leash, struggling to hold Echo in place. His mind raced. Echo never did this. He was trained. He only attacked when there was danger, when he sensed something was wrong. Victor let out another weak laugh. "Maybe he's just confused. Dogs have bad days, right?" Daniel didn't answer. He was too busy watching Victor. The man's hands were shaking. His face seemed calm, but his eyes weren't. Back at home, Echo still wasn't himself. He paced near Daniel's desk, his tail stiff, his nose sniffing the air as if searching for something. Then he stopped. Slowly, he moved toward a drawer and scratched at it. Daniel frowned. "What is it, boy?" Echo whined, his paws pressing against the wood. Daniel hesitated before pulling the drawer open. Inside were old case files, papers stacked high, dusty from years of being untouched. Echo shoved his nose into them, sniffing fast. Then he stopped. Daniel followed his gaze. His stomach clenched when he saw the name on the file. Jake Holloway. It was the last case Jake had worked on before he died. A smuggling case, drugs, weapons, stolen goods. But it had gone cold. No arrests. No leads. Just a dead end. Daniel's eyes moved down the page and landed on a single name. Victor Alvarez. His grip tightened on the file. Echo sat beside him, his body still, his ears sharp. Daniel's throat felt dry. What did Jake find out? Echo let out a quiet whine. His body stayed tense. Daniel's hands felt cold as he held the old case file. The paper was worn, edges curling from age. He flipped through the pages slowly, his eyes moving over Jake's handwriting, trying to find something, anything, that could explain why Echo had reacted so strongly to Victor Alvarez. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of pages turning. Echo sat beside him, his big brown eyes locked onto Daniel's face, as if he, too, was waiting for answers. The dog's ears twitched every now and then, his body tense, alert. Daniel swallowed hard as he read through the notes again. Jake had been investigating smuggling before he died. That much was clear, but there was nothing here that connected Victor to the case. "Doesn't mean he's innocent," Daniel muttered under his breath. Echo let out a low, quiet growl. The sound sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. He reached for a box on the shelf. Dust puffed into the air as he pulled off the lid. Inside, Jake's old notes were stacked neatly, untouched since the day he was killed. Daniel's fingers hesitated before picking up a small black notebook. The leather cover was worn, the corners bent from years of use. He flipped it open, scanning the messy handwriting. There were lists of names, addresses, and numbers that didn't make sense at first. Then, at the bottom of one page, Daniel's breath caught. Explosives. The word was underlined twice, as if Jake had wanted to make sure he wouldn't forget it. Daniel turned the page with shaking hands. More notes. Stolen chemicals, detonators, wires, everything needed to build bombs. And then, right in the middle of the page, underlined again, Alvarez Auto Repair. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. His body tensed, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. Jake had been onto something dangerous. He had been digging into a case that involved explosives, and, somehow, Victor's shop was in the middle of it. Echo let out a quiet whimper and nudged the notebook with his nose. His dark eyes were full of something Daniel couldn't quite place. Fear. Concern. Daniel reached out and scratched the dog's head. "We're not crazy, are we, buddy?" he whispered. Echo's ears perked up, his body still stiff. Daniel sat back and grabbed his laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he searched for anything linking Victor to bomb making. At first, everything looked clean. Victor had owned his repair shop for over 15 years, paid his taxes, had no criminal record. But Daniel knew better than to trust what was on the surface. He started digging deeper. After an hour, his eyes landed on something strange. A company, one he had never heard of, had been sending large amounts of money to Victor's shop for the past year. On paper, it looked normal, like payments for repairs and equipment. But something fell off. Daniel clicked through more records, tracing the company back to its owner. His breath caught in his throat. It was a fake business, a shell company, and the real owner? Someone tied to illegal explosives trafficking. Daniel's stomach twisted. His hands clenched in a fist as he sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. Jake must have found this before he died. He must have been getting close to the truth. Echo let out a short, sharp bark, startling Daniel out of his thoughts. The dog stood up, his muscles tight, his tail stiff as he stared at the laptop screen. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I know," he murmured. "This just got a whole lot worse." The next morning, Daniel walked into the precinct, a folder tucked under his arm. Inside were copies of Jake's notes, financial records, and the link between Victor and the fake company. He pushed open the door to Captain Reynolds' office without knocking. Reynolds, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing. "Briggs," he said with a sigh. "What now?" Daniel dropped the folder onto the desk. "I found something," he said, his voice firm. Jake was investigating explosives before he died. Victor Alvarez's shop is connected to a shell company that's been moving money through illegal channels. "He's involved, Captain." "I know it." Reynolds opened the folder and flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. Minutes passed in heavy silence. When he finished, he exhaled and pushed the file back toward Daniel. "This is thin," he said. "It's not enough." Daniel's jaw tightened. Jake wouldn't have written this down if it wasn't important. Reynolds leaned forward, folding his hands. "And what do you expect me to do? Open an investigation based on a dog's reaction and a few notes?" Daniel clenched his fists. Echo isn't just any dog. He was trained to detect danger. He knew something was off about Victor. He took a shaky breath. "And Jake? Jake was my best friend. He wasn't reckless. If he was looking into this, it means something." Reynolds studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "I understand you're grieving. I miss Jake too. But this isn't solid proof." Daniel's hands curled into fists. "So what? We just ignore it." "I'm telling you to be careful," Reynolds said, his voice quieter now. "If Jake was onto something big, it got him killed." Daniel grabbed the folder and stormed out of the office, his heart pounding. He wasn't giving up. Daniel clenched his fists as he walked out of the police station to his car. He gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. He finally understood that Jake had been investigating something huge before he died, and Victor Alvarez was at the center of it. But without proof, no one would believe him. He had to find evidence, and there was only one place to get it: Victor's repair shop. Late at night, Daniel parked a block away and moved through the shadows, Echo by his side. The shop was dark except for a faint light in the back. The air smelled of oil and metal. He picked the lock, slipping inside, careful and silent. Echo growled low. Something was wrong. Daniel scanned the shop and spotted a locked cabinet. Picking the lock, he yanked it open. Blueprints, cash, bomb materials. His stomach twisted. Jake had been right. He grabbed his phone, snapping pictures. Then, a voice. "Looking for something, detective?" Daniel spun. Victor stood in the doorway, two men at his sides. One reached into his jacket. "Gun." Daniel reacted fast. He hurled a wrench at the light. Glass shattered. Darkness swallowed the room. "Echo now." The dog lunged. A man screamed. Gunfire rang out. Daniel ducked, dodging through the chaos. He swung a metal rod, slamming it into Victor's ribs. "Echo, come." The dog broke free. They ran. A bullet whizzed past. Victor's furious voice echoed behind them. "Find them. Now." Daniel didn't stop. He had proof. But now Victor knew, and he wouldn't let Daniel live. Daniel didn't stop running until he and Echo were far away from the repair shop. His heart pounded as he slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel with shaking hands. Echo sat beside him, panting hard, his eyes locked on the road as if he knew danger was still close. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror. No headlights, no movement, but he knew Victor wouldn't let this go. He had seen too much. Taking deep breaths, he forced himself to focus. He had the proof, but he needed more. If he went to his superiors now, they'd hesitate. Victor had money, influence, and powerful friends. Daniel had to be smart. He had to set a trap. By morning, he had a plan. He fed false information to a trusted informant, making sure Victor's people overheard. He made it seem like the police had dismissed the case, like the investigation had hit a dead end. He let rumors spread that Jake's death had been ruled a gang-related accident, and that no one suspected Victor of anything. Victor took the bait. That night, Daniel watched from a distance as the crime boss set up a meeting, a secret arms deal at an abandoned warehouse. It was the perfect chance to catch him in the act. The warehouse loomed in the darkness, surrounded by empty lots and rusting fences. Shadows stretched long under the flickering streetlights. Daniel crouched behind a stack of crates, watching Victor step out of a sleek black SUV. He shook hands with a man in a dark coat, the buyer. More men stood around, armed, guarding the deal. Beside him, Echo tensed. The dog's ears perked, his body stiff. A deep growl rumbled in his throat. He had smelled Victor. Daniel whispered, "It's him, isn't it?" Echo didn't wait. He launched forward, breaking into a full sprint. His paws pounded against the concrete as he charged straight at Victor. Victor barely had time to react before Echo leaped, knocking him to the ground. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Guns were drawn, men shouted, and Daniel sprang into action. He tackled one of the guards, twisting the gun from his grip and slamming him against a crate. A shot rang out, shattering a window above. Glass rained down. Echo held Victor down, snarling, teeth inches from his throat. Victor thrashed, trying to shake him off. "Get this damn dog off me." Daniel didn't let up. He weaved through the fight, taking out another man with a hard punch. More gunfire. His pulse hammered in his ears. Victor scrambled up, shoving Echo away and making a run for it. Daniel sprinted after him. "Echo, go." The dog recovered fast, launching forward again. Victor had nearly reached the SUV when Echo grabbed onto his arm, locking his jaws tight. Victor screamed, stumbling. Sirens wailed in the distance. Red and blue lights flashed against the warehouse walls. The police had arrived. Officers stormed in, shouting commands. Victor's men dropped their weapons, hands up. Daniel grabbed Victor, shoving him to the ground as the cops swarmed around them. Handcuffs clicked shut. "It's over," Daniel said, breathing hard. Hours later, back at the station, Daniel laid out all the evidence: bank records, hidden blueprints, bomb materials. But the final piece? A confession. One of Victor's men, caught red-handed, spilled everything. Jake hadn't been killed in a random attack. Victor had ordered it. Jake had gotten too close, and Victor had silenced him. Justice had come at last. A week later, the department held a ceremony. Jake was honored for his bravery, his name forever remembered. Echo stood tall beside Daniel as the chief awarded him a special medal. He wasn't just a retired K-9, he was a hero. As they stepped outside, Daniel looked down at Echo and smiled. "We did it, buddy." Echo wagged his tail, eyes bright. For the first time in a long time, he looked at peace.